cold January evening in 1984, the air was thick with anticipation. Football fans across the country huddled around their televisions, eagerly awaiting the third quarter of Super Bowl XVIII. The Los Angeles Raiders were asserting their dominance over the Washington Redskins, inching closer to securing their victory. But the greatest moment of the night wouldn't happen on the field. Instead, it would unfold during a brief, seemingly inconspicuous commercial break that would forever alter the course of technology and advertising history. As the game resumed, viewers were greeted not with the typical razzle-dazzle of a Super Bowl ad, but something far more arresting. The screen flickered to life with a vision of a bleak, dystopian future. A sea of grey faces, men and women dressed in identical, lifeless uniforms, marched in perfect unison down a sterile hallway. Their eyes were hollow, their expressions blank, as though their very souls had been stripped away. The scene cut to an imposing figure on a massive screen, his voice booming through the theatre in which these people were now gathered. "We are one," the figure intoned. "We are united in our glorious ideology." But in the distance, someone dared to be different. A woman, young, athletic, and resolute, raced forward, clutching a sledgehammer in her hands. Her vivid colours and determined face stood in stark contrast to the uniformed masses around her. A narrator's calm voice cut through the tension. On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. In that brief minute, Apple didn't just sell a product. It captured the imagination of an entire generation. The commercial, directed by the visionary filmmaker Ridley Scott, was not just an ad for a new computer. It was a rallying cry, a promise that technology could be something more, something that would empower individuals rather than control them. At that moment, Apple transformed from a fledgling company into a symbol of rebellion against a growing digital world controlled by faceless corporations. At the heart of this revolution stood Steve Jobs, Apple's co-founder, and the driving force behind the Macintosh project. Jobs believed fervently in the power of technology to liberate people, not imprison them. To him, the Mac wasn't just a tool for work, it was a statement of identity, a way to give people the means to create, innovate, and challenge the world around them. The commercial encapsulated this vision perfectly. Apple was the hammer-wielding rebel, and Big Brother represented every corporation that sought to turn humans into machines. But in the decades that followed, the story took a twist few could have predicted. As personal computing grew from novelty to necessity, Apple's influence expanded in ways that even Jobs might not have imagined. The Macintosh, once the quirky alternative to IBM's business machines, paved the way for the development of the iPhone, iPad, and a vast ecosystem of digital services that touched nearly every aspect of modern life. Apple no longer needed to fight the system. It had become the system. By the early 2000s and 20s, Apple had reached heights of success that seemed almost surreal. Its products were no longer the tools of artists and rebels. They had become staples of everyday life. With a market value soaring past $3.4 trillion in revenues that eclipsed the economies of entire nations, Apple has cemented itself as a global powerhouse. But with that immense success came an equally immense responsibility and a growing unease among critics. For years, Apple had built its brand on the idea that it was different, that it was a force for good in the world of technology. But as its power grew, some began to wonder, was Apple still the hero of the story? Or had it become the very villain it once sought to destroy? For one, Apple's control over its App Store was unparalleled. Nearly every app, every piece of digital content flowed through its tightly managed ecosystem. And for the privilege of using Apple's platform, developers had to play by the company's rules. Apple's infamous 30% tax, the fee it charged developers for using its App Store, had become a point of contention for many. There was no escaping it, and those who tried, like Epic Games, found themselves embroiled in legal battles. Apple had become the gatekeeper of the digital world, deciding who could and couldn't thrive within its walls. What had once been a utopian vision of personal empowerment was now criticized as a monopolistic stronghold. Even as Apple continued to introduce cutting-edge products and services, the whispers grew louder. Was this the same company that had once rallied against Big Brother? The irony was not lost on those who had witnessed Apple's rise from a scrappy startup to a global titan. Steve Jobs had once championed the idea of wheels for the mind, envisioning computers as tools to unlock human potential. But as the years went on, Apple's products seemed less like instruments of creativity and more like portals to a controlled digital ecosystem, one where Apple dictated the terms. Tim Cook, Jobs' successor, had guided the company through an era of unprecedented financial success. Under his leadership, Apple had expanded its reach into everything from health services to entertainment, with its Apple TV Plus streaming service producing hits like Ted Lasso. But Cook, unlike Jobs, was a master of efficiency, not vision. His focus on optimizing supply chains and maximizing profits sometimes seemed at odds with Apple's original ethos. In many ways, Cook had perfected the machine that Jobs had built. But some feared that in doing so he had lost sight of the human element. Stories emerged from Apple's suppliers, like Foxconn, where workers toiled in grueling conditions to produce the shiny gadgets that lined Apple's store shelves. The suicide nets installed outside Foxconn's factories became a grim symbol of the cost of Apple's success. And yet, despite the growing criticisms, Apple's stock continued to soar. Consumers still lined up for the latest iPhone, and the company's quarterly earnings reports were filled with staggering figures. Apple had become a giant, and for many, that was precisely the problem. The company that had once inspired people to throw a hammer at the system now seemed untouchable. As the story of Apple continues to unfold, it raises difficult questions about the nature of progress. Can a company that once prided itself on rebellion remain true to its roots as it ascends to unprecedented heights of power? Or does success inevitably breed control, turning even the most well-intentioned innovators into the very forces they once opposed? Only time will tell how Apple's narrative will evolve. For now, we are left with a paradox. A company that once liberated us from the tyranny of technology now seems to hold more power over our digital lives than ever before. In a world where every swipe, click and tap funnels through Cupertino's carefully curated ecosystem, one has to wonder, who is really in control?